Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hello and welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. Today we're going to explore the complexities of importing food into the U.S. It's a large topic, so let's get right into it. Ben, welcome back. Great to see you.
Great, Kevin. Good to see you too. Glad we can talk about this timely and relatively large issue in FDA and USDA jurisdiction.
Yeah, food encompasses a lot. So let's dive right in. What are the key regulations, the key FDA regulations that businesses must be aware of when they're importing food into the U.S.?
From the FDA space, there is a USDA piece to it, which we'll talk about in a second. But from the FDA side, you have to think of it in terms of safety of the food. Really, it's sort of the wholesomeness of the food and what's in the food. And then secondarily, what's on the label or what's in the marketing. So those are the two big areas. It's really, you think of it in terms of adulteration, right? Ways that food should not be adulterated, and then misbranding, ways that food should be properly labeled and not misbranded. That's generally how the FDA thinks about it. There are some situations where food actually, there's a pre-distribution compliance step in some food categories. But FDA's jurisdiction of food is very, very broad. FDA has jurisdiction over all food that is not regulated essentially by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, right? So USDA is the agricultural department. USDA is responsible for meat and poultry and eggs. And we've talked about this in some prior episodes. FDA basically has everything else. But a lot of food that FDA has jurisdiction over has meat and poultry and eggs, right? It has components, it has animal protein in the food. Mm-hmm. So USDA and FDA both regulate that, but mostly FDA worries about testing the food or checking for the labeling. FDA has the primary jurisdiction for those kinds of things. USDA has a permitting obligation, right? Or actually the importer has an obligation to obtain a permit from USDA whenever you import anything that's under USDA's jurisdiction. So that's a separate process. It's a pre-import process. You have to have the permit or else you can't bring it in. We've talked previously about the two agencies have a little bit sort of an opposite approach to food issues. From the USDA perspective, under their jurisdiction, nothing comes into the country unless there's a permit if it's required. Right? You have to go to USDA and get a permit. This might be for animal protein or it could be for fruits and vegetables. They have jurisdiction over fresh fruits and vegetables as well. The reason USDA has that jurisdiction is that agency is worried about protecting United States agriculture from pests or infections or diseases that could impact the U.S. cattle, U.S. poultry, U.S. plants, right? U.S. agricultural industry. And so they're trying to prevent these, imported items from acting as a vector to bring in the diseases and bugs that could infest the U.S. agriculture in the United States. FDA, on the other hand, is worried about whether the food is not adulterated or misbranded and been manufactured according to FDA's GMP requirements. So they're looking at it for completely different reasons. So you can't bring in something under USDA jurisdiction unless you have a permit first. From the FDA side, basically, everything can come in unless the FDA finds a problem with it, right? So it's the opposite. You don't have to usually get a permit. The only exception in the FDA side where you have to do something in advance is going to be with canned foods. And canned foods are not just foods in cans. Canned foods would be foods in like pouches, Tetra Paks, these sort of cardboard boxes that are hermetically sealed, things that are shelf-stable food that is not just a dry good, right? So not like noodles. Cooked noodles, right, that are wet, that would be under a canned food because of the moisture. And what you're worried about is the risk that Clostridium botulinum, which is the insect, the bug, the bacteria that produces the toxin that causes botulism, which kills you. Those bugs live in an environment where there's no oxygen, right? They're called anaerobes. And so canned foods, they're only slightly acidic, right? So acidic, like something that's acidic would be like citrus is naturally acidic. It's got that tart, pungent taste to it. And that's an indication of a taste of an acid. So naturally acidic foods, the bug can't live in. But foods where it's just a little acidic, right? It's just a little below neutral. They're called low acid canned foods that have moisture in them. Really, it's a water activity measurement, but moisture. Those foods have to be properly processed in a way that ensures that the Clostridium won't grow inside the can. So you have to kill that Clostridium. And there's a couple ways you do it, but the different ways that you do it, you have to present to the FDA the one you picked. And they have to look at that first, that process, and they have to approve that process. And then they have to issue you certain numbers. They're called SIDs, Schedule Process Identifiers, but it's specific to the manufacturer of the food and to the food and to the package and to the package size. It's very, very specific. And you have to have that SID for that particular food, and then you can bring that food in. If you don't, then FDA will, without question, if they see it, they're stopping it. It's not coming in. It's also possible that the manufacturer will go onto an import alert, which is specific for companies that export food that are subject to these requirements but don't meet them, because FDA is very, very concerned about it because botulism is such a serious risk.
Sure.
So USDA and FDA, USDA has a lot of pre-shipment requirements, the permit requirements, and that includes like yogurt is a good example. It has dairy in it. And so yogurt, you have to get a permit from USDA to bring in yogurt, but you also have to comply with FDA requirements to bring it in under FDA laws. So both jurisdictions apply. So the laws and regulations sort of are different for each of those two.
Yeah.
But the two big issues for FDA are adulteration and misbranding, and in essence, the canned food, and then you have the low acid canned food requirements.
So it's slightly complicated.
Right. Yeah, that's to say, right. So that's right. And in order to try to make it simpler from the FDA perspective, I'd like to break it into sort of the two main categories of adulteration and misbranding. The way the government thinks about enforcing the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, the way the FDA thinks about it, is they for the most part are thinking about, is there something like, what is the product first? Is it a food or is it a drug? Is it a dietary supplement? Is it cosmetic? Because that's going to dictate the specific requirements for that particular item. That's the first thing they want to do. What is it? We're going to talk about food, so put everything else aside. So we know it's a food. The next thing is there something wrong with it? And that's how the government's asked. That's the question they're asking. They want to know if they want to ask if there's something wrong with it. Well, what kinds of things? Things that result in the food being deemed adulterated under the law. The law says if this is true, then the food is adulterated and you cannot import it, you cannot distribute it in interstate commerce. And we'll talk about what that means. The other big category I mentioned is labeling, mostly. Is it misbranded? Mm-hmm. And in the labeling category, there's sort of two categories. One is there are things that you have to say on a food label, and you have to do it in a certain way. And then there's things that you cannot say on a food label. And if you do, you get in trouble, right? Mm-hmm. So those are the different ways that you have misbranding. And so that's sort of how the FDA is thinking about food. And it helps break it down, because whether it's seafood or it's grain or it's bakery items, or it's, no matter what it is, there's adulteration issues, and then there's labeling misbranding issues.
And if they find either of these issues, what do they do next? What's the process? I imagine obviously they're going to stop it from coming into the country, but what happens at that point?
Sure. So we've talked about how the FDA handles imported products where there's a violation. Those systems kick in, right? They may do a sampling, they may do a label review, they may do something at the border to examine the cargo, and then what are they doing? They're trying to figure out if there's something wrong with it. And if they find something wrong with it, they're going to detain the shipment, and you're going to go through the detention process. Maybe you have to cook it. Maybe if they find salmonella in a seafood product, a shrimp or something like that. Raw shrimp. Well, raw shrimp's going to be cooked anyway, and so maybe the importer says, well, I can get rid of that salmonella. I'll cook the shrimp. And FDA will say, okay, that's fine, but you have to give me your proposal, show me what you're going to do, show me why you think it's going to work, and then later you're going to send test results to prove that it worked, and then we'll let it in. But now you've imported a cooked shrimp, right? You no longer imported a raw shrimp, so you've changed the product. Now you also changed the labeling requirements, because raw shrimp and cooked shrimp might have different labeling requirements. But that would be that's happening in the detention process at the border. If it's a labeling issue, you may relabel it, right? It might be that you put a sticker over something that's wrong, or you add information to the label that's not currently there. You fix the labeling problem, and then FDA will let it come in. If you fail at any of those things, or you decide you don't want to do it, then FDA will just refuse the shipment, and then customs rules kick in for getting the stuff exported or destroyed. So the same stuff happens at the border that we've talked about before. What I want to today talk about is, okay, so what are the big categories of adulteration, and what are some of the big categories of misbranding, right? I think that'll help people see, right? So let's start with adulteration. Sorry, I sort of took over this podcast a little, Kevin. So
no one's here to see me talk. Go for it, man.
Very good.
Let's hear it.
So let's talk about adulteration. The law actually, it deems something to be adulterated. And so things can be adulterated in a number of different ways. I mentioned something might be in the product that's not supposed to be in the product. Like what? Well, like dangerous bacteria, right? It might be in the product and it's not supposed to be there. So what happens? The statute says if there's any poisonous or deleterious substance that could cause harm, it's adulterated. Well, salmonella is a poisonous, deleterious substance that could cause harm.
Can I interrupt real quick? I'm
Sure.
curious. So how do they can't test all of them. They just have to test a certain percentage to assume that that's enough. Is that kind of how they do it?
So as far as shipments, let's talk about two different ways. One, like there's a lot of food coming in.
Right.
A lot of food. And so FDA inspects a very small percentage. And they do it and they sample and test ordinarily, those food items and for problems that are the highest risk, the categories, right? They go after, the things that could hurt the most people. So seafood tends to be a relatively high risk food.
Yeah.
Ready to eat foods, anything that's ready to eat is a high risk food because there are no further processing steps. Right. It just comes in, goes on the shelf, goes in your cupboard, and then you eat it. Right. There's nothing in between. You're not going to cook it. No manufacturer is going to process it. It's just going to be eaten. So those are really high risk foods. And so FDA will screen and they'll target their resources at the border for higher risk commodities, food products, and also for higher risk problems. Now, once they've sampled something, they might also sample it. If they sample it for salmonella or bacteria, pathogens, they might also sample it and also test it for food colors. They may look for prohibited food colors or food colors that are in it that are not included on the label because they already have the sample anyway. They might test it for some toxins. They might test it for filth, insect filth, animal filth, human filth, right? In the manufacturing process, there's a risk that stuff gets into the food that's not supposed to be there. That's one of the ways that food can be adulterated. If it contains any putrid or filthy decomposed substance that makes it unfit for food. And so people think, "Ooh, that's gross." Well, when you're eating animal protein, you're eating something that's dead, right? Things that are dead decompose. It's what they do. So the question is it too decomposed by the time it's getting to you? Right. Right. And food, protein always starts to decompose when it dies. And so over a period of time, that's going to overtake. Now, very often when something smells bad, it has gotten so decomposed that it's self-limiting. It's probably not unsafe, but you wouldn't eat it because you got that reaction to it. But there's plenty of times when something is bad for you and you can't tell, right? There's no smell to it, or there's not even a taste to it. And so FDA is going to focus on those kinds of things too. So FDA is going to examine sort of like the higher risk foods generally. They might test it for other things rather than just the high risk stuff because they already have the sample. And they're also going to look at the label at the same time. All right, they've already got the product in front of them, so they're going to look at everything. Yeah,
they may as well. Yeah.
Right. And so FDA examines, I don't know what the numbers are, but it wouldn't surprise me if they're sampling less than 1% of the imported product coming into the country. And if you think about how much product is coming into the country, that's actually not very much. Yeah. And if you look at the target, the hit rate, their hit rate has actually gotten much better over the years because they're using smarter technology for targeting the shipments that they sample. So in one sense, once they have the sample, they're going to test it for a lot of things because they already have the sample. Sometimes they target based upon the fact that they want to see what's happening in an industry. I've seen they'll do surveys where they'll collect 1,000 samples of fresh produce that's being imported from wherever it's coming in. Well, fresh produce is mostly coming across the southern borders, coming out of South and Central America because you can fly it here, or you can truck it and it's not very far. Right, where it's not coming from Asia, it's not coming. Sometimes you have some fresh produce coming out of Europe because you can fly it here, but it's not Asian material. That's usually canned or shelf stable or frozen foods. So, but they may decide that they're going to collect 1,000 different samples, and it goes across the different fresh produce categories. And FDA literally just goes out. They just increase the targeting rate for fresh produce, and they have to hit their numbers, and they go out and they just sample it, and it goes in for different testing, pesticide testing, filth testing, any microbiological contamination, lots of things that they're testing.
Wow, that's a lot. That's interesting. That's really interesting stuff. And as far as the labeling goes, I mean, obviously that could be quite the undertaking if you mess that up. That's a lot to have to relabel would be a lot. Is that a common problem at the border? Is mislabeled stuff a common problem?
I have to look at the numbers, but in my experience, the many years I've been doing it, the vast majority of FDA charges that are not about stupid things like the facility is not registered or like those kinds of things. You put that away. You make it about adulteration or labeling. The majority of violations actually are labeling violations. And the reason for that is the violation is right in front of the FDA when it comes in the port, right? When it comes in and it goes into the warehouse, and FDA inspectors go out and look at it, and they want to do an examination, and they may sample or they may not. But when they get there and they look at the label, they may take pictures of that label or take examples of that label and then just stop it on labeling, because they don't have to spend the money sampling it. They don't have to spend the money sending it to the lab. They don't have to pay for the reagents and the media and everything to do the testing. They already have a violation. It's a labeling violation. So they hit it because they can. I think the government's general sense is that if you screw up the label, you might have screwed something else up too. So we're just going to hit the easy stuff, right? And then we'll deal with the harder stuff later. So there are a lot of labeling issues that arise. Most of the kinds of things, if you look at food labeling is standardized in the United States, right? You've got a front of the package. You have a statement of identity. The thing is this: it's cut green beans, it's wheat-based, spaghetti noodles. It's whatever it is. And the name you use has to be the common or usual name. It has to be the name that people call it.
People understand it as
right. Yeah. So for foods that don't have a common or usual name, then you can get into more fanciful names, but it has to be descriptive, reasonably descriptive of the product. When you name a product, you also have to say whether or not if it looks like it might have some flavor, like have a particular kind of flavor, you have to say whether or not it's naturally or artificially flavored. You have to say whether or not it's artificially colored. Right. You have to say those things on the label so the person looking at it can know whether they're looking at a natural flavored item or not. Interestingly, natural flavoring are flavors that are naturally derived. Okay. Even if the flavoring is not you can have natural flavors that reinforce a flavor that you expect. Let's say you look at something, you think it's going to be chocolate, and there is some chocolate in there that's flavoring it. There's some cocoa in there that's flavoring it, but maybe there's something else that's enhancing the flavor that's not chocolate. Okay. Well, you have to disclose that too, that you have flavor enhancers in there that are not chocolate. So people realize they're not just getting chocolate when they're getting this thing. The other thing that is interesting is if you look at colorants rather than flavors, a beet juice is a natural color, right? It's not chemical, it's not chemically synthesized, it's naturally derived. Carrot juice, beta carotene, is a natural color. But if you add beta carotene or beet juice to a food to change its color, now the food is artificially colored.
Even though it's artificially colored by a
natural component.
Okay. Yeah. Because it's not natural to the original product.
The food you're looking at is not that color. So the food has been artificially colored, but with natural colors. Yeah. Right. So that's the front of the label. It has you have to put a net quantity statement. Is it 12 ounces? Is it 150 count? Is it 2 pounds? And then you turn the label and you get to the information panel. And that's where you find the foods, that's the food nutrition facts panel. And that's a standardized white panel with all those black lines and all that information and serving size and how many servings per container and percent daily value of all these different mandatorily declared components, right? So that panel has things you have to put in there: fat, cholesterol, carbs, protein. And you have to declare them certain ways. That way, all food is the same when it comes to that label. Now, you can add things, you can voluntarily add things, but you have to declare them certain ways when you do. And they can go in that panel. So FDA is very strict about that panel because everybody's looking at that panel and they want to rely on it. And then you have the ingredient statement. And so these are the things that are not, it's not how much vitamin A is in there, but it's what the vitamin A came from, right? It might be from a food ingredient that's producing that vitamin A. And then you get into who's responsible for it. The manufacturer, packer, or distributor is named. And then you get into where it's from, right? If it doesn't say anything, then the rule is it must be a product of the United States. If it's not, then you have to say product of China, product of India, product from Mexico, right? You have to put it. And so those are all the things that have to be in there, and you got to get them all right. It turns out, there's a lot of things you can screw up there, right? So it's advisable to get somebody to look at your label to make sure you got it right. But you really should get it right because it's the easiest thing for FDA to detect. So they're going to look at it without question.
Yeah, I would think so. All right. Wow, fascinating stuff. Definitely complicated, but thank you very much for going over that, Ben. And thank you for tuning into FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance with Attorney Benjamin L. England. To connect with Ben, head to FDAImports.com. And of course, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Ben, thanks so much for being here. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Good to see you. Take care.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.